My name is Nora Ellison, and I was 29 years old the morning a bank manager named Gerald Foss called my personal cell phone and asked me, very carefully, whether I was aware of the recent activity on my grandmother's accounts. I was standing in my kitchen making coffee. I set the mug down and asked him what he meant by recent activity. He paused the way people pause when they're choosing words that won't cause a panic, but need to communicate urgency. And he said that some transactions had occurred over the past 6 weeks that he felt a family member should be aware of, and that my name had been listed as the emergency contact on the account. I asked how much we were talking about. He said he'd rather discuss it in person. I left the coffee on the counter and drove to the bank. My grandmother, Ruth Ellison, had spent 43 years as a school librarian in a small Minnesota town, and she had saved money the way librarians read, quietly and consistently and without making a fuss about it. She had never owned anything extravagant. She drove the same car for 11 years. She clipped coupons into her 80s. And she had, over the course of a careful and modest life, saved just over $214,000, which sat in 2 accounts at First Community Bank on Linden Street, accounts she had held since 1987. My sister Delia was getting married in September. I parked outside the bank and sat in my car for a moment, and in the space between turning off the engine and opening the door, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand until that exact moment. I knew what the recent activity was going to be. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories, where the quiet ones finally get heard. This channel is for the people who answer cruelty with calm and shame with the truth. If that sounds like your life, then you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe, drop a comment, and stay with me, because this story goes a long way before it goes right. Before any of this, there was a library. Ruth Ellison had run the Millhaven Elementary School library for 4 decades, and if you grew up in that town, you had a card she'd issued you and a memory of her at the circulation desk. Reading glasses on a beaded chain, quiet and precise, and entirely without the kind of meanness that diminishes people. She remembered every student who came through, what they liked to read, what they were ready for next. She ran the summer reading program for 37 years. She knew Dewey Decimal the way some people know their own street. She was not a dramatic person. She did not make scenes or demand attention or speak loudly in restaurants. She was the kind of woman who got things done so smoothly that most people around her didn't notice the doing. I am her older granddaughter, and I am enough like her that people who knew us both would smile when they saw us together. The recognition of a particular kind of temperament, passing cleanly from one generation to the next. Delia, my younger sister by 3 years, is enough like our father that people who knew our father would also smile, but for different reasons. Our father, Ruth's son Martin, had the kind of personality that fills a room and empties a bank account in roughly equal measure. He was charming and impulsive and generous with money he hadn't earned yet, and by the time Delia and I were teenagers, he had mostly exited our lives in the gradual way of a man who means to come back and keeps not getting around to it. Our mother raised us largely alone, with help from Ruth, who drove 2 hours every other weekend and showed up with groceries and quiet and the particular comfort of a person who is simply steadily there. When our mother died 4 years ago, Ruth became more present in our lives, not intrusively but in the way a tide comes in, filling space that had opened up. She was in her mid-80s by then, still sharp and still funny and still clipping coupons, but slower on her feet and aware in the way the very old become aware that the time for doing things was finite. She had moved into assisted living 2 years before the bank call, a pleasant place called Meadow Ridge that she had chosen herself and budgeted carefully for. She liked it there, genuinely, which surprised everyone, including her. She had a room full of books and a friend named Harriet who played gin rummy with her every Tuesday, and she still got the library's newsletter because they'd made her an honorary member of the board. When she retired, Delia and I were both listed on her account as emergency contacts, but not as signatories. Ruth had been very clear about that. She managed her own money and intended to continue doing so. She had a financial advisor named Tom Breck, who she spoke to quarterly and who had helped her set up the distribution schedule that covered her Meadow Ridge fees and left enough remainder to grow slowly and eventually. In her words, "Go to you girls when I'm done with it." That was the word she used. Done, like finishing a book. Gerald Foss was a careful man with wire-rimmed glasses and the demeanor of someone who has delivered bad news before and learned that calm is a kindness. He closed his office door and offered me water and set a folder on the desk between us, and then he told me what had happened in a way that was measured and clear. Over a period of 6 weeks, beginning in early July, Ruth's primary checking account had been drawn down by a series of withdrawals and transfers totaling $94,000. The transactions had been made in person, at this branch by Ruth herself, accompanied each time by my sister Delia. I looked at the transaction summary he slid across the desk. 11 separate visits. The amounts ranged from $4,000 to $18,000, each one signed by Ruth's hand. I asked if anyone had spoken to Ruth during these visits, whether anyone had asked her what the money was for. Gerald's expression did something complicated. He said that the teller who had processed several of the transactions had noted in the account file that Ruth had seemed uncertain during at least 2 visits. The teller had flagged it internally and spoken with Gerald, who had then initiated a quiet review before deciding to call me. I asked what uncertain meant specifically. He said the teller had written that on the 3rd visit, when asked by the teller how she was doing, Ruth had looked at Delia before answering, and that on the 6th visit, when a new teller had asked Ruth to confirm the purpose of the withdrawal as part of their standard elder financial protection protocol, Ruth had said she wasn't entirely sure, but that her granddaughter had explained it was necessary. She'd looked at Delia before she answered her own question about her own money. I sat with that for a moment. I asked Gerald when he'd started looking into it. He said 3 weeks ago, after the 8th transaction. He said he'd waited until he was certain before calling because he didn't want to create a family situation based on insufficient information. I told him I appreciated that. Then I asked if there was anything he could do to protect the account going forward while I figured out what was happening. He said that as a non-signatory emergency contact, I didn't have legal authority to freeze the account. But he said that if I could provide documentation establishing a concern about Ruth's capacity to make these decisions freely, there were protective measures the bank could implement. I thanked him and I took the transaction summary and I drove straight from the bank to Meadow Ridge. My grandmother was in her room reading when I arrived, glasses on the chain, a novel open in her lap, Harriet's latest gin rummy scores on a notepad on the side table. She looked the way she always looked, contained and comfortable and pleased to see me in the particular way of someone whose days are regular enough that an unexpected visitor is a genuine event. I sat in the chair across from her and I asked how she was, and she told me about Harriet's recent winning streak and a new audiobook program that the facility had started and a bird that had been coming to the feeder outside her window that she couldn't identify. Then I asked, as gently as I knew, how things were going with her finances. Ruth's expression shifted in a way I recognized from childhood. It was the expression she made when a question she'd been waiting for finally arrived. She said things were fine. She said Dia had been paying with some things. I asked what kinds of things. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window. She said, Delia had explained that the wedding needed more money than she had expected, and that she'd asked Ruth to help, and that Ruth had wanted to help because that was what family did. I asked how much she'd helped. Ruth looked at me then, and in her eyes was something I hadn't seen there before. Not confusion exactly. More like the particular discomfort of a person who knows they've done something and isn't entirely sure why they did it. She said she wasn't certain of the exact total. My grandmother, who had managed her own accounts since 1987 and knew her quarterly interest rate from memory, wasn't certain of the exact total. I took her hand and held it and didn't say anything for a moment. Then I asked if she'd wanted to give the money, whether it had felt like her own decision. Ruth looked at the window again. At the bird feeder, at the unidentified bird. Delia can be very persuasive, she said finally, in a quiet voice. The kind of voice a person uses when they're answering a question they've been asking themselves. I need to tell you about Delia, because she isn't a villain in the way that word usually lands, and I think the story is less useful if I flatten her into one. Delia is 26 years old, and she is magnetic and funny, and the kind of person who makes friends in checkout lines. She is also the kind of person who has always believed, with genuine conviction, that the people who love her will find a way to make things work for her, because in her experience that has consistently been true. Our mother found a way. Ruth found a way. I have found a way more times than I should have, and less often than I used to. The wedding was real. The fiancé, a man named Carson who I liked well enough, was real. The venue they'd chosen, a renovated barn outside the city that cost more per hour than most people make in a week, was also real. Delia had planned it with the thoroughness she brings to things she genuinely wants, which is considerable thoroughness. What she'd done, when the costs exceeded what she and Carson had saved, was go to Ruth. And she had gone back again and again, 11 times over 6 weeks, each time framing it a different way. The catering deposit, the photographer who was about to give their date to someone else, the flowers which had to be ordered months in advance or the specific ones Delia wanted wouldn't be available. The dress alterations which had gone over budget. Each ask had been specific and urgent and individually reasonable sounding. Taken together, they added up to $94,000 extracted from a woman in her mid-80s who loved her granddaughter and had been made to feel, visit by visit, that she was the only one who could prevent a catastrophe. I know how Delia does this because I had watched her do versions of it my entire life, not maliciously, not with a plan mapped out in advance. She sees a need, she identifies someone who loves her, and she applies the pressure that love makes available. She has never fully understood that love has a cost and that eventually the cost exceeds the account. What was different this time was the account was Ruth's, and Ruth was 86, and the teller had written in the file that Ruth wasn't sure what the money was for. I called Delia that evening. I want to be honest about how I felt making that call, because how I felt was important to how I handled it. I was angry in the deep, quiet way I get angry when something has gone wrong that I should have seen coming and didn't. I was also sad, which is different from angry but lives right next to it sometimes. And underneath both of those, I was scared, because $94,000 from a $214,000 account is not a recoverable situation if it continues. Delia answered on the second ring, cheerful, which told me she hadn't expected this call yet. I told her I'd been to the bank. The cheer lasted about 3 seconds. She immediately began explaining. The wedding had gone over in ways no one could have predicted. Carson's parents had contributed less than they'd promised. The venue had added fees. It had been a series of impossible situations, and Ruth had offered. I asked if Ruth had offered or if Delia had asked. Delia said Ruth understood how important this was to her. I asked if Ruth had understood that $94,000 was the number. Delia said she hadn't taken it all at once, it had been manageable amounts each time, and that it wasn't like Ruth needed the money for anything. She was at Meadow Ridge, everything was paid for. I said that Ruth's account was what kept Ruth at Meadow Ridge if her monthly distribution ever fell short. I said that Meadow Ridge cost $4,000 a month, and that $94,000 was almost 2 years of that coverage. Sitting gone, Delia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nora, it's my wedding." Like those 3 words constituted an answer to the math. I told her I wasn't calling to fight with her. I was calling because she needed to know that the bank had noticed, and that people beyond our family were now aware of what had been happening, and that the next conversation about this was not going to be between the two of us. She asked what that meant. I told her I'd be in touch, and I ended the call. Then I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and started writing down everything I knew and everything I still needed to find out and everything that needed to happen next. AIR is what I knew from working in healthcare administration for 6 years, which is not the same as being a lawyer, but is close enough to elder financial issues that I had a working map. What Delia had done had a name: financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Whether Ruth qualified as a vulnerable adult depend on whether her cognitive and decision-making capacity had been compromised to the point where she was unable to protect herself from undue influence. The teller's notes, suggesting Ruth had seemed uncertain, had looked to Delia before answering, had said she wasn't sure what the money was for. Those were not casual observations. Those were indicators. Whether what Delia had done was criminally actionable depended on a threshold I didn't know how to evaluate by myself. What I did know was this: the money was gone. Ruth had signed the withdrawals. Delia had not forged anything or accessed the account without Ruth's physical presence. The question was whether Ruth's presence had been meaningful, whether she had consented to those transactions in a way that was free and informed and her own. I made 3 calls the next morning. The first was to Tom Breck, Ruth's financial advisor, who had not been informed of any of this and whose reaction told me clearly that he agreed it was serious. The second was to Meadow Ridge's director, a woman named Karen Wold, to ask whether Ruth had shown any signs of cognitive change in recent months, and whether there were any documented observations I should be aware of. The third was to a lawyer named Sandra Okafor, whose name I found through a colleague who said she was the person you called in Minnesota when a family situation involving an elder crossed into legal territory. Karen Wold called me back within the hour, which told me something as itself. She said she'd been wanting to speak with someone from Ruth's family for a few weeks. She said that beginning in early July, around the time the bank visits had started, the staff had noticed changes in Ruth's presentation during family visits. She was more anxious, more easily confused. After Delia's visits in particular, she had seemed tired and unsettled in a way that wasn't her baseline. Karen said that Meadow Ridge had a policy of documenting unusual behavioral observations for exactly these situations, and that Ruth's file contained several notes from July and August describing her as appearing stressed following visits. She said one staff member had asked Ruth directly if everything was all right, and Ruth had said that she was trying to help her family, but she wasn't always sure she understood what she was helping with. "I'm not always sure I understand what I'm helping with." I wrote that down word for word. Karen said she was glad I'd called and that Meadow Ridge had an obligation to report suspected financial exploitation to the County Adult Protective Services Office, and that based on our conversation, she felt that obligation had been triggered. She said she would file the report that afternoon and that I should know it was happening. I told her I thought that was the right call. After I hung up, I sat for a moment with the particular sensation of a situation that has just acquired its own momentum, separate from anything I was driving. The bank had noticed. Meadow Ridge had noticed. Now the county would know. Delia didn't understand yet what she'd set in motion. Sandra Okafor met me the following day in an office that was tidy and direct, much like Sandra herself. She listened to everything I had without interrupting, which I've learned is the mark of someone who is actually processing rather than waiting for their turn to speak. When I finished, she asked several questions in quick sequence. Whether Ruth had been evaluated for cognitive capacity recently, whether there was any documentation of Ruth making independent financial decisions in the months before the withdrawals began, whether Delia had any legal authority over Ruth's accounts, power of attorney, a joint account, anything. The answers were no, yes, and no. Sandra explained the landscape clearly. Ruth was presumed legally competent unless and until a court determined otherwise. Her signatures on the withdrawal slips were her own. That meant the withdrawals were technically valid transactions. However, she said, there is a legal theory called undue influence, which is different from fraud or forgery. Undue influence occurs when someone in a position of trust uses that position to override another person's free will, substituting their own wishes for the other person's wishes. It doesn't require deception in the traditional sense. It requires a relationship of trust, a vulnerable person, and pressure applied in a way that corrupts the voluntary nature of the decision. She said the teller's notes, the Meadow Ridge staff observations, the fact that Ruth had told staff she wasn't sure what she was helping with, those were consistent with a pattern of undue influence. She said the Adult Protective Services investigation that Meadow Ridge had triggered would make its own determination, and that determination would matter for what came next. She also said something that I needed to hear clearly. The money being recoverable, she said, is a separate question from whether what Delia did was wrong. They're related, but not the same. The civil question is whether Ruth can get her money back. The other question is whether the county prosecutor finds sufficient evidence of criminal exploitation. I can help you with the civil side. The rest moves on its own. I asked what the civil path looked like. She said it involved establishing Ruth's diminished capacity at the time of the transactions, demonstrating undue influence, and filing a civil claim against Delia for restitution. She said it was possible but not simple, and that one of the complicating factors was that the money was almost certainly already spent. I asked about the wedding. Sandra allowed herself a small, grim expression. "The wedding is in 3 weeks," she said. "If that money has been contracted to vendors, recovering it gets significantly more complicated after those contracts are performed." 3 weeks. I drove to Delia's apartment that evening. Not to fight. I had made a decision in the car on the way over, that I was going to stay exactly as calm as I needed to stay to accomplish what needed to be accomplished. Delia answered the door in the middle of what looked like seating chart work. Little paper squares arranged on the dining table. Carson was in the kitchen. The apartment had the particular organized chaos of a wedding month, and for a moment, seeing it, I felt the full sadness of what was happening alongside the anger. I asked Carson to give us some time, and to his credit, he read the room and left without asking questions. I sat down across from Delia at the table, covered in seating arrangements, and I told her what I was going to tell her as plainly as I could. Meadow Ridge had filed a report with Adult Protective Services. The bank had initiated a review. I had retained an attorney. And, unless we found a way to address what had happened that worked for Ruth, the situation's going to be resolved in ways that neither of us controlled. Delia's face went through several things in quick succession: disbelief, then anger, then something that might have been the first edge of genuine fear. She said she hadn't done anything illegal. Ruth had been there for every transaction. Ruth had signed everything. I said I knew that. I said that wasn't the whole question. She said I was overreacting and that I had always been the one who seems simple things complicated and that this was her wedding. I let her finish. Then I said, "Delia, Ruth told the staff at Meadow Ridge that she wasn't always sure what she was helping with. I want you to think about that for a moment. Not about the money. Just about Grandma saying that." Something moved across Delia's face that I hadn't seen in a long time. She looked down at the seating chart squares on the table. I told her I wasn't there to take her wedding away. I was there because the alternative to us solving this was other people solving it for us. And those other people had a different set of priorities than keeping the family intact. I asked her how much of the money had already been paid out to vendors. She was quiet for a long moment, then she said 61,000. That 61,000 had gone to the venue, the caterer, the photographer, and the florist in deposits and first payments that were non-refundable, which left 33,000 somewhere. I asked where. She said it was in her checking account. She'd been holding it for remaining payments and day of expenses. I told her that 33,000 needed to go back to Ruth's account that week, before anything else happened. Delia looked at me with an expression I recognized from when we were children, the one she made when she understood that the answer was no and was deciding whether to keep asking. She said that if she sent it back, she wouldn't be able to pay the remaining vendors. I said that was a problem she and Carson needed to solve. I said that Ruth's financial security was not available to solve it. The Adult Protective Services investigation arrived formally the following week. A caseworker named Devin Marsh, who was professional and thorough, and whose presence at Meadow Ridge to interview Ruth was, I was told, deeply upsetting to my grandmother in a way that broke my heart when I heard about it. Ruth was sharp enough to understand what the investigation meant. She was sharp enough to feel the particular shame of having needed it. She had spent 86 years being the person who held things together, who kept the books straight, who made sure everyone had what they needed. And now people with clipboards were coming to assess whether she'd been capable of managing her own checkbook. I went to see her the evening after Devin Marsh's visit, and she was sitting in her chair with her book closed in her lap, not reading, just sitting. I sat across from her and waited. After a while, she said, I should have said no. I told her that saying no to Delia has never been easy for anyone who loves her. Ruth said, that's not an excuse for not doing it. I said I knew. I said it wasn't her fault. She said, of course it's partially my fault, Nora. I knew what she was doing by the 4th time and I let her do it anyway, because I didn't want to see her upset. She looked at me over her glasses in the way she'd looked at me over those glasses since I was 4 years old. That is a failure of backbone, and I'm not too old to admit it. I loved her so much in that moment I didn't know what to do with it. I took her hand and I told her we were going to fix it as much as it could be fixed, and that the only thing I needed from her right now was to let me handle it. She said, you always did handle things better than you let on. I said I'd learned from someone. She picked up her book and found her page, and I sat with her until she fell asleep in the chair, the way she sometimes did in the evenings, and then I let myself out quietly and drove home and called Sandra Okafor and told her everything I knew. The $33,000 came back to Ruth's account 9 days later. Delia sent it without another conversation between us, which told me that Carson had been involved in the decision and that Carson had better financial instincts than my sister or a greater capacity for shame, possibly both. The return of the money didn't resolve the Adult Protective Services investigation. That moved on its own timeline and its own criteria. Devin Marsh interviewed Ruth twice, reviewed the bank records, reviewed the Meadow Ridge staff notes, and consulted with a physician about Ruth's cognitive status. The physician's assessment was careful. He said Ruth showed some age-related cognitive changes but remained legally competent. He said her competency didn't preclude the possibility of undue influence. Because undue influence operates on the emotional and relational level, not purely the cognitive one. He said a competent person can still be manipulated by someone they love and trust. Devin Marsh's report, when it came, found credible indicators of financial exploitation through undue influence. It did not make a criminal referral, partly because Delia had returned the recoverable funds, and partly because Ruth declined to characterize what Delia had done as intentional exploitation. Ruth said, in her interview, that she believed Delia had convinced herself it was all right, and that people who convince themselves of things are different from people who know they're doing wrong. That distinction mattered to Ruth. I'm not sure it should have mattered as much as it did, but it was hers to make. The $61,000 that had gone to vendors was a harder problem. Sandra Okafor filed a civil claim on Ruth's behalf against Delia for the full $94,000, arguing undue influence and seeking restitution. Delia hired her own attorney, a less expensive one than she'd have gotten if she'd still had $94,000, and the response was that the transactions were voluntary and Ruth had been present and competent for all of them. The negotiation that followed took 4 months and was conducted entirely between the attorneys. I was not in the room and neither was Delia. Ruth was kept informed but not asked to participate beyond expressing her wishes, which she did with the precision of a woman who has spent a lifetime being clear about what she wants. What she wanted was not to go to court. Not because she was afraid of what would come out, but because she was 86 years old and her time was finite and she didn't want to spend it in depositions. She told Sandra to settle for what was gettable without a trial. What was gettable was $58,000, paid by Delia and Carson in a structured arrangement over 3 years, with a civil judgment recorded against Delia that would affect her credit and follow her if she defaulted. The remaining $36,000 of the $61,000 that had gone to vendors was not recovered. Ruth accepted the settlement with the composure of someone who has done the math and made peace with the remainder. She told me afterwards, sitting in her room with Harriet its gin rummy scores on the side table and the unidentified bird at the feeder, that $36,000 was a real amount of money, and she'd rather have it than not have it, but that she'd spent 43 years teaching children. That some things you don't get back, and it seemed the lesson applied. She picked up her novel, then she looked at me over her glasses. "How is Delia?" she asked. I said I didn't know. We hadn't spoken since the night I'd gone to her apartment. Ruth said, "She'll need to find her way to being sorry. Not to me, to herself. That takes longer, but it's the one that matters." The wedding happened. I know this because Carson's mother, who had my number from a previous family occasion, and who I think felt personally responsible for not having contributed more to the original budget, texted me a photo of Delia in her dress outside the venue. She looked beautiful. She always did. That was never the thing. I didn't respond to the text and I didn't attend, and Delia and I did not speak for 8 months after the night in her apartment. When we did finally speak at Christmas at Ruth's insistence, it was careful and short and not resolved but not hostile. Delia did not apologize that day. She looked like she wanted to and couldn't find the architecture for it. Ruth sat between us at the table and talked about the unidentified bird, which had now been identified by Harriet as a varied thrush, far outside its usual range, what birders call a vagrant. "A bird in a place it doesn't usually go," Ruth said, looking at both of us. "Just trying to get through the winter." I didn't know if that was about the bird or about us. With Ruth, it was usually both. Delia called me 4 months after Christmas. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was making the coffee I'd never finished the morning Gerald Foss had called, or so it felt. She said she'd been thinking about what she'd done to Grandma. Not to the family, not to me, specifically to Ruth, and that she hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. She said she hadn't gone in with a plan. She said the first time she'd asked Ruth, it had felt like asking. And by the time she understood the size of what she'd taken, it had already been taken. And she'd kept going because stopping would have meant looking at what she'd already done. I said I understood the mechanics of that even if I didn't excuse them. She said she was sorry. She said it simply. Without the decorations, people sometimes put on apologies to make them about themselves. She just said she was sorry for what she'd taken from Ruth, and for putting me in the position of having to fix it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Tell Ruth." Delia said she'd been scared too. I said Ruth had been waiting for it and that she deserved to hear it from you directly, and that the only thing harder than making that call is deciding not to make it and carrying it instead. Delia called Ruth the following Sunday. I know because Ruth mentioned it the next time I visited, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been proved right about something she believed in. She said she'd forgiven Delia, not because what Delia had done was all right, but because forgiveness was something Ruth did for herself, and she was too old to spend energy on things she'd decided to put down. She told me she'd also told Delia that if she ever came to her with a financial request again, Ruth would be happy to help with a very reasonable and specific amount that Ruth herself would decide on. And that would be the end of the help. She said Delia had agreed to that immediately, which Ruth took as a good sign. Gerald Foss received a card from Ruth at Christmas that year, a simple note thanking him for making the call he'd made. She'd asked me to get his full name from the bank, which required a conversation with him that he clearly found awkward but managed graciously. She addressed it to him personally and wrote in it that she'd been a librarian for 43 years and had learned that the people who do the most important things usually don't get thanked for them. She told me she'd also written that she hoped his instinct to call had been affirmed and that he should trust it again the next time, because there would be a next time. Gerald, I was told by a teller I knew from the neighborhood, kept the card on his desk. The structured repayment from Delia and Carson came in on time every quarter for 3 years. I know this because I asked Ruth's financial advisor, Tom Breck, to monitor it as part of his regular oversight. Tom had reorganized Ruth's accounts after the situation, adding additional protections and establishing a clearer protocol for any future large withdrawal. He'd also had a frank conversation with Ruth about what to do the next time a family member approached her with a financial request, which Ruth had received with the good humor of someone who knows she needed to hear it. Ruth's account balance, with the settlement and savings returned and the financial reorganization complete, stabilized at something manageable, not what it had been. Not the full $214,000 she'd built over a careful lifetime, but enough for Meadow Ridge and enough for the remainder, and enough for whatever Harriet's gin rummy skills might eventually cost her. I have thought about what I would do differently in the time before Gerald Foss called me, and the answer is one thing. I would have talked to Ruth directly about what would happen if someone she loved asked her for money she felt she couldn't say no to. Not accusingly, not preemptively pointing at Delia. Just the conversation, Grandma. You've worked hard for what you have, and I want to make sure you know that you can always call me before you make a financial decision. Any financial decision. Just so someone else knows. Just so you're not alone with it. That's it. That's the whole thing I would have done differently. Because Ruth was not cognitively impaired in a way that made her unable to make decisions. She was a competent woman who loved her granddaughter and found herself alone in a bank with a withdrawal slip and years of being the person who found a way. And she needed someone to have told her in advance that it was all right to say no, that the money she'd saved was hers, that love does not require martyrdom. Nobody had told her that. She'd had to learn it the hard way, which is a terrible thing to learn at 86. The lesson I carry from it is simpler than the legal complexity that surrounded it. The older people in your life who have spent decades being careful and quiet and self-sufficient, they are often the last ones to ask for help and they are sometimes the most available, to be pressed by the people who know how to press them. Check in on the account. Ask the questions. Make it easy for them to tell you when something is happening that they're not sure about. Not because they can't handle it. Ruth could handle most things better than people half her age. But because love is supposed to be the thing that gives you someone to call, not the thing that makes you too embarrassed to call. Gerald Foss made the right call. He trusted something he noticed and he acted on it before it was too late to act. He is not a dramatic person either, I don't think. He's a bank manager in a mid-sized Minnesota town who pays attention to the accounts of old women with beaded glasses chains. And in paying attention, he preserved something that mattered. Ruth would say the hero of this story is the teller who wrote it down. The one who noticed Ruth looking at Delia before she answered a question about her own money, and who wrote that observation in the account file where it could be found. I think Ruth is right, which is almost always the case. I visited Ruth last month on a Tuesday, which I try to do when I can because Harriet is formidable at gin rummy, and Ruth needs a cheering section. Ruth won 2 out of 3 games and attributed it to superior strategic thinking, which Harriet disputed loudly and cheerfully. Walking back to Ruth's room afterward, I asked her how she was feeling about everything, using that word intentionally to leave space for her to say whatever she wanted. She thought about it for a moment, the way she thought about things, fully and without rushing. She said she felt all right. She said she wished she had the $36,000, but that wishing was a young person's hobby, and she had better things to do with her time. She said she was grateful for Gerald and for Sandra and for me, and that being grateful was something she'd always been good at, and she intended to stay good at it. Then she said something I've thought about every day since, sitting in her chair by the window, where the varied thrush still occasionally appeared, according to Harriet, on cold mornings. She said, you know what the saddest part was? Not the money. It was realizing that Delia didn't think I had the right to say no. That she'd decided my love for her was something she could spend. She picked up her book and found her page. The saddest part, she said again, quieter, is that she was almost right. You have a grandmother or grandfather, a parent or an aunt or an uncle, someone older who has spent a lifetime being careful with what they built. Go see them this week. Not to check on the accounts, though you can do that too. Just to sit with them and make it clear that you are the person they can call. Be the call they make before anyone else gets to them. Be Gerald Foss. Be the person who notices something and acts on it before it becomes a story someone else has to tell. Drop a comment below. Tell me if this reminded you of someone. Tell me if you are someone. Hit subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.